Hallo, Christian. Agus fáilte de bhuile fáilte géise as a seomar a seo agus fáilte géise leine. Welcome to you all. It's lovely to see you all either online or here in the room with us. And it's a great pleasure to have you participating with us today in today's seminar from Dr. Giles Sutherland. Ba Giles na olanoch ag olhain agents through light òraid agus college olhain balia clia agus hure PhD Edinburgh Richard Demarco bo olhain gunjay and in 2020. Hij gerði gobedd Young Times mar neach brennechi jalain vo 1999 agus hij na úter groen leorichen. Hij na vaarst volsichtje agus och young jorich hij gerði gobedd as Poland, Lithuania and Ukraine agus Romania. So Giles has studied at the universities of Edinburgh, Stirling, Aberdeen and University College Dublin. His PhD on the work of Richard Demarco and the summer school Edinburgh Arts, which he's going to be speaking to us about today, he gained from the University of Dundee in 2020. He's an art critic who's worked for The Times since 1999, and he's the author of several books, including poetry, and he's recently worked in Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Romania. Hig Giles a Chirloch Elanta, agus ha Eurosach again as an dachid litrachus as an Dorania came as Hugh agus h-Alba leisinoch. A varroch gedishin ha chria and sas an cultar na h-Alba. She had cymulsú le náisian an buga an tefaniad na Europa a chai vuchig and an unit na public and social Sovietoch. She dynnu practicoch a han an Giles cudioch, agus hai ceart ha bultioch a vi togal shedichen se legal proven sa hai vi brennachig na h-Alba. Ma sin hai raunsachig a yenu luch h-Alba practicoch a lehich Timstead, agus stoch a gre an h-Alba agus green a chush colla haring a gana tursan mara eder cultaroch ag Richard Demarco, siad toshachig agus a creachnachig and an Alba. Giles comes from an artistic family and he has a passion for both literature, in which he first graduated, and the visual arts. In addition, his heart is in Scottish culture, observing the small nations of Eastern Europe that were suppressed in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Giles is also a practical man. He's likely to build sheds and cut down trees as he is to judge the arts. And he studied practical artists such as Timstead. And it's perhaps this same interest in bringing art and action together that drew him to Richard Demarco's intercultural voyages, which began and ended in Scotland. And it's on those voyages that it's our great pleasure to welcome him to address us today. Giles, it's over to you.
Tapalat, Abby, and Fieskerva, everyone. Once I get my hands around the technology, please read this. Can everyone read this? Okay. Yeah, I feel a mixture of pride and shame and certain degree of guilt, because I did try on a few occasions to learn a bit more Gaelic, but I would like to thank Sabhal Mòr Ostaig, because I had the privilege of spending a few weeks in the library when I was writing my PhD a few years ago. So I feel welcome and I feel at home, but on the other hand, I feel this kind of cultural tension, and I'm sure you all understand what I'm talking about. This is a slide, a photograph taken in 1972 at the first Edinburgh Arts summer school in Edinburgh, and it comprised mainly North American students. Richard Demarco, for those of you who don't know, ran an art gallery in Edinburgh, which was set up in 1966, but he, as he told me, he was bored out of his mind and he wanted to do other things. So he had this idea of setting up a summer school. The reason I'm showing you this slide, which shows Jamie MacDonald, I think a very well-known piper, is that I was invited to do a research seminar at the University of Dundee when I was doing my research. And I used this slide. I think it was an introductory slide. And there was a great snort of derision from one audience member. He wasn't Scottish, he was British, so I'll leave you to guess which country he came from. And that snort of derision made my blood boil for different reasons, but one of them was because my my great-grandfather was a piper, and he taught piping. And I grew up with pipe music around me at school and at home. And to have my culture and family insulted in such a way was, it was deeply upsetting, especially in that context. One of the things that's interesting about Demarco is that he bridged the gap between what I call avant-garde culture, high art, and traditional cultures. I can't think of a better term, and it's not quite accurate. But he brought these two seemingly disparate elements together. They weren't, it wasn't a clash, it wasn't a dissonance, it was a creative union from which both sides emerged richer and enriched. The small drawing you see on the right-hand side, I found in the Demarco archive when I was researching the PhD. It's a sketch, and it shows a road. It says this is an idyllic landscape of small rolling hills with innumerable wooden farm buildings, and it's the road to Zakopane from Krakow, near Oświęcim. Now, Oświęcim is Polish for Auschwitz. And Demarco had come up with this concept of the road to Mikołajskie. It was a real road and a metaphorical road. The real road is actually in the Ochil Hills, very near where I grew up. But the metaphor of the road allows a great extension of ideas. The road can join with all the other roads and somehow draw everything in. So this small road in the Ochil Hills leads both metaphorically and practically to the roads of Europe and eventually winds up in Oświęcim. And I think that's quite a remarkable metaphor. The idea of time and exploration was central to this concept, and I would like to just read very briefly a line or two from T.S. Eliot, who in fact was a great influence on the best known poet of Skye, of Rassay, of Scotland and Gaelic, Sorley MacLean, who studied at Edinburgh University, studied English, so his poetry was undoubtedly influenced by Eliot. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. So it's this idea of taking perhaps what looks like an ordinary road and imbuing it with qualities that one might not have thought about or been exposed to. And Demarco has written about the road. Discovering the road was like opening a door beyond which lay the reality of my dreams of a world beyond the confines of the 20th century. It promised a landscape I would wish to define with pen and ink and watercolour. Each bend and corner would be like another door, opening up gradually more and more aspects of the landscape I had known in my childhood when every door and every road was an invitation to a mysterious place forever desirable and forever new. It was the sacred threshold through which I had to pass, which would reveal the space in which I would seek freedom from all restricting linear concepts of time. Demarco grew up in a Scots-Italian family. The family had a remarkable cafe, which they called Maison Demarco, and it flourished in the 20s on the promenade at Portobello. I'm sure many of you know Portobello. This was the context from which Demarco came. It was modelled on a Parisian cafe, and it had a kind of European feel to it. So that linked Demarco immediately into the cafe culture of Europe, which, as you're all aware, was a kind of it was a trope and a real thing for intellectuals, artists to meet in this kind of cafe. So Krakow and Paris and Vienna and Prague, these places were all important as a kind of meeting place for intellectuals. Demarco taught in Duns Scotus Academy. As you know, Duns Scotus was quite a well-known philosopher. It's thought that he came from Duns in the Borders near where I am. It was organized by some Catholic brethren from Ireland who sought to provide a Catholic-based education in Edinburgh. And if you look at the top right of the slide, you can see Demarco with a couple of senior pupils in his art room. And Demarco even then was remarkably rebellious as a teacher and pushing the boundaries of what he thought education was and was not. He was not unknown to take classes out sketching to other galleries, etc. This is a follow-on, really, from the gallery idea. Jim Haynes, who you can see in the photograph with the lady who's burning a copy of Lady Chatterley's Lover, set up a bookshop. It was the first of its kind in the United Kingdom, and it was just off George Square in the middle of the university, and it became a place where people could go, they could get coffee, and they could read books that just weren't available elsewhere, and it specialized primarily in New European writing, but also served as a small gallery space. And it was here that Demarco began exhibiting not only his school pupils, but some other artists. And unfortunately, in its wisdom, the university decided to demolish this whole area, and it's no longer there. So following on from that, as well as setting up the Traverse Theatre, Demarco began to think about how to display contemporary art. And he did this by gathering together a group of business people who helped him buy a premises in Melville Crescent in Edinburgh. You can see the statue of Lord Melville on the bottom right slide. And this became a kind of base for Demarco's activities from the mid-60s onwards. But as I said at the beginning, the idea of displaying and selling contemporary art soon began to pale, because essentially he wasn't interested in art as a commercial venture. And as his thinking developed, he began to understand that pedagogy in its broadest sense was the direction. He took a lot of inspiration from Black Mountain College, which was established in North Carolina in 1933. Black Mountain College was in itself the result of the Bauhaus being thrown out of Nazi Germany when the Nazis came to power in 1933. Many of these people left but regrouped, and decided to set up an interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary art college. It was a very experimental place. At the top, you can see some people hanging off a dome, and this is what's known as a Bucky Fuller dome. Buckminster Fuller was one of the faculty at Black Mountain College. Demarco was invited to go on holiday to Greece, to the island of Aegina, and he couldn't sit still, and after a few days got bored and discovered that on this island there was a summer school called Aegina Arts Centre, and he also discovered that Buckminster Fuller had been invited to do a talk there the previous year. So Demarco became friendly with Janusz Jervoš, who was the person in charge, and he used this model to set up Edinburgh Arts. And only a year later, he had assembled a group of people, had gone on a tour, a lecture tour of North America, had gathered a whole number of students, and began a 6-week summer school in the space of less than a year. And this was the first introductory brochure. It did rely heavily on United States students, because he had managed, I don't know how, to give credit, university credits to these students. So if they came for 6 weeks in the summer, that was applied to their final mark in their home university and college. One of the great characters who joined this faculty, if I can use that term, was the Romanian artist Paul Neagu. And I've just been in Romania, and to my delight, at the Museum of Contemporary Art, there's one of Neagu's pieces in the foyer. You see it. There was an exhibition linking traditional Romanian culture with contemporary art, and Neagu was there. He was a bit of a rebellious character. Demarco had helped him to basically defect from Romania. They'd met in 1968. So he was charged with working with the students in a very experimental way. And here you can see some kind of a workshop taking place in Greyfriars Kirkyard, in the centre of Edinburgh. Neagu again on the left, because he joined, as I say, the Edinburgh Arts faculty, and the Edinburgh Arts summer school developed. It became less of a static idea and more of a peripatetic one. And you see Neagu here on the left holding ragwort. I think I'm right in identifying that as ragwort at the Black House Museum in Lewis. And on the right, there's a photograph of the founder of your institution, Sir Iain Noble, and Paul Neagu on the left, Demarco on the right. Demarco's friendship with Sir Iain extended back before Edinburgh Arts and before Sabhal Mòr Ostaig. By profession, Noble was a merchant banker, and I think Demarco and he were friends well before either of these manifestations of culture and learning. One of the major exhibitions at the Demarco Gallery took place in 1972. Demarco had a long, or has in fact, a long association with Poland. So in collaboration with the Museum Sztuki in Łódź, he organized a huge exhibition called Atelier 72. This was held partly in the Demarco Gallery, and involved many of the major artists from Poland, the post-war cohort of artists, including people like Tadeusz Kantor. And it was a great success in that most people had not hitherto been exposed to art from anywhere in Eastern Europe, particularly Poland. And as I'm sure most of you understand, it had a very rich cultural life, especially in the visual arts. Another character, another faculty member, if I can put it that way, was Joseph Beuys. He won't need an introduction to most of you, but he lived a relatively short life. I wasn't fortunate enough to meet him, but if you look at the photograph on the top left, you see Beuys and Demarco. That's actually taken on the shores of Loch Awe in Argyll, and it shows ploughed hillside ready for Sitka spruce plantations, and even at that time it was controversial, and it's something which Beuys noted with great distress and disapproval. The slide below that shows Beuys on the Mòr Ostaig, and this was an action, as he called it, that was filmed, involved him burying gelatin or fat in the moor to give it energy, and it was basically later incorporated into a film, which was then used as part of a performance piece at Edinburgh College of Art called Celtic Kinloch-Ranach Scottish Symphony. And again, it shows Beuys's interest in Celtic culture, Staffa, Mendelssohn, Ossian. He was linking up with a cultural memory that allowed him to avoid the darker interpretations put on German mythology. And I think that's why he basically was so warm and felt so comfortable in Scotland. You can see him at the bottom left lecturing to a group at what was then called the Edinburgh Poorhouse. It was basically a plumber's workshop. It was a kind of lean-to structure, that part of which was actually leaning literally on the Flodden Wall. So that's one of the walls that surrounded the city of Edinburgh. And on the right, bottom right, you see Beuys emerging from a small door in a set of larger doors. And these were the doors to the poorhouse workshop, which had old posters from previous events pasted on them. Again, Beuys did a lecture at Melville College, which no longer exists in its present form. This was in the school gymnasium, and one of Beuys's great techniques was to use blackboards. Just as a side note, if you look at the left picture, you can see a cameraman filming. And one of the great frustrations about researching archives is that you get clues, but sometimes the clues don't lead anywhere. So I tried in vain to find this film of this 12-hour lecture, because every time I asked anybody and said, well, what on earth did he speak about for 12 hours? Nobody knew, and there was no notes, or but I couldn't imagine anybody standing for 12 hours, or indeed anyone in the audience staying for so long. But that is indeed apparently what happened. So what's remarkable is that Demarco managed to get Buckminster Fuller and Joseph Beuys in the same room and to participate in what actually was a really important conference, and it's a conference whose implications resonated for decades around Scotland. They were talking about the implications of oil and what it meant, primarily based on energy and carbonisation. So exactly the kind of things that are being debated, or not even debated, accepted now. But this was well ahead of its time, and no one was really thinking about in those terms in the early mid 70s. And one of Buckminster Fuller's greatest interests was alternative sources of energy, and he basically believed in a kind of idealistic egalitarian way that energy could and should be free. Here we have Beuys, and on the left, Lady Rosebery, who was one of the founders of the Edinburgh Festival, and Buckminster Fuller together. And this photograph actually became an artwork. It became a limited edition print. The photograph was actually taken by Robert Lebeck, although he's not generally credited with the photograph. Demarco editioned it as a print, and I believe you can still buy it. So, but it's, I don't like to use the word iconic, but it's a kind of significant meeting in Edinburgh in the Botanic Garden. Edinburgh Arts, as I said, developed. Top left slide shows a group of students at Kilmartin Glen, and I'm not quite sure what they're doing apart from lying sunbathing, but Demarco was trying to discuss ideas that they might not have come into contact with, especially when we talk about Neolithic stone circles and burial chambers and that whole complex at Kilmartin, which is still the site of archaeological investigation. But he took these students there, and I don't quite know, it's very difficult to assess what kind of impact this kind of summer school has. That's one of the difficulties that I had in my research, was to try and ask the question, well, if you take people to Kilmartin Glen and you ask them to do, let's say, a happening, how does it actually affect their perception and build on their knowledge and understanding? And that's quite a difficult question to ask and to answer. I should mention that on the right there's a large catalogue, and this is what happened after each summer school. So there were 10 in all. They made an exhibition at the end and they produced a catalogue. So we have a very valuable record, published record, as well as all the archival material, which is in the National, or some of it's in the National Galleries of Scotland. The other half is at Summerhall in Edinburgh, but there's a huge question mark above it as to what will happen. And maybe at the end we could talk about that. Here are the doors. So if you look here and here, bottom left, these are what were known as the poorhouse doors, but became an artwork that Beuys made. And he basically took the doors and added a red light under one of them, and it became known as New Beginnings Are in the Offing. Beuys and Demarco and various other people became involved in a debate about Jimmy Boyle, who was then a well-known prisoner at Barlinnie, and it ended up in Beuys taking the Secretary of State, I think it was George Younger, to court for cruelty, and the basic idea was penal reform. But as a direct result of that, the funding for the Demarco Gallery was removed by the Scottish Arts Council. Demarco was accused of bringing the name of Scottish art into disrepute. So his funding was removed. Beuys didn't know anything about this, but eventually, when he did find out, he decided to make an artwork, and he did, and it was sold, and some of the proceeds went to help Demarco in his plight. Charles Stevens was a young man in the early 70s and was one of a group that included Nick Sirota and Sandy Nairn and Mark Francis. They were at Oxford, and Demarco, how can I put it, was enamored of such institutions. Charles Stevens came to Edinburgh and worked as what we might now call an intern. He basically worked for free during the Edinburgh Festival, as I myself did a decade or more later. And Charles was very helpful when I was writing my PhD. He, I would say, was the most perspicacious and astute observer and analyst of Demarco and his activities. And one of the problems with the extant literature on someone like Demarco was that he was, in effect, the commentator on his own actions. There was very little analysis, but a lot of documentation. And Charles was one of the few people who'd actually taken the trouble to analyze some of the things that were happening around him. As the years progressed, Edinburgh Arts became more of a peripatetic event and process, actually, than a static traditional summer school. And it became peripatetic in the sense that groups of people, some of whom stayed with the course for 6 weeks and some of whom came in and out, travelled from Hajarim, which is a huge complex in Malta, and they made journeys northwards to Callanish and to Brodgar on Orkney and documented their work on the way. So they worked with each other. So they collaborated on artworks and projects, but they also collaborated with the teachers, and the teachers were usually what we might call local experts. So groups of students would collaborate with teachers in various parts of the journey, and often responding in situ, or in terms of art jargon, site-specific work. This is a map drawn in Demarco's inimitable hand. He says the journey investigated the time-space of mythology and therefore explored hills and rivers, wells, springs, and underground caverns associated with legend and folklore, following in the footsteps of Ulysses, Calypso, King Arthur, Gawain, etc., etc., etc. And with typical Demarco hyperbole, he manages to incorporate different mythologies from vastly different time periods and weaves them into a single narrative, which, when you're there and listening and you get sucked into it, seems entirely plausible. but when you stand back and analyze it, it becomes a kind of rather confused mishmatch of different and often competing or contradictory ideas. And this is a drawing by Paul Neagu, which attempts to put in visual form some of the energy. It's a kind of, what is it, a tornado of ideas and people and places. So it's a kind of visual representation of that admittedly very beautiful and dynamic energy that's generated, or that was generated on these journeys. This is quite remarkable. It's a kind of disclaimer on one of the application forms. It says, no excess baggage, physical and mental, should be carried from the past of each participant. New dimensions should be revealed in the art of each participant. Edinburgh Arts will not provide ideal space for those artists wishing to work only within the space of a studio over an extended period of time. Edinburgh Arts is about risk and experimentation. So it's the idea that art can exist outside the normal frameworks that we impose upon it, such as galleries and museums, and that art can be created outside of a studio in anywhere, and it's not a particularly comfortable process. So this was actually more or less drummed into the participants, although anecdotally on these journeys there were inevitable complaints and problems, and if you can imagine the logistics of moving dozens of people around Europe over 6 weeks, you can probably get a picture of some of the things that might have happened. Bottom right, this is Jimmy Boyle with Jane McAllister, who Jane worked with Richard. She was originally a jeweler from Cumbria, from Carlisle. And she met Richard when he was giving a talk at a Chinese artist's studio gallery just very near Hadrian's Wall. Demarco was talking about the voyage of the Marquess, and we'll come on to that. But Jane was a kind of right-hand person in the gallery for many years, and I don't know exactly when this photograph was taken. It's 1980, but I went there as a young school child. I think I was 16 or 17. I actually went to the special unit, by which time Jimmy Boyle had just left, but I met another one of the inmates called Hugh Collins, who sadly died quite recently. And I have a very, very vivid memory of sitting absolutely petrified in this cell with this guy with a huge cut across his neck. It was a cut made by a butcher's cleaver. And but the special unit was an amazing place because it was democratically run between the prisoners and the prison officers, and it allowed prisoners massive freedoms that wouldn't have been allowed in a normal penal setting. They were allowed to make artworks, they were allowed on visits. They had theatre productions coming to the prison, and of course, significantly, they collaborated with Edinburgh Arts. I love this photograph on the bottom right. It kind of, for me, shows what's best about Demarco. This openness, this love, if you like, this joy at being alive. This is on board the Marquess, which circumnavigated the United Kingdom or the British Isles, and became a kind of peripatetic summer school on the water. And I love this photograph. It shows Sorley MacLean on the left, reading from his book Springtide, Neat Tide. I wanted to read this little extract. It's an essay by Hamish Henderson, but it encapsulates for me, although I wasn't there, what I feel some of the participants on this bark may have felt when they heard the Gaelic being spoken in the place in which the language was rooted. The ship is anchored near Raasay. I read Ian Crichton Smith's translations, d'Eir, and I heard MacLean himself read his own poems in the original Gaelic. To take the translations first, since they were my first exposure, opening the book was like opening the door on a morning of sea-filled brightness. There was a feeling of unspecifiable freedom and intensity. The voice in the poems was at once unleashed and stricken. There was a tremendous sense of capacity, of emotional liftoff, a boldness and ardour that had a high romantic voltage, yet there was also a deeply modern guilt, a self-castigating intelligence which stuck like a hook in the throat of rapture. I think that's a remarkable description of somebody coming to the poetry in translation, but still sensing some of its meaning and force. By the way, at the back of the photograph, the man at the very back is Adam Robson, who was a Scotland, he was capped for Scottish rugby and became head of the Scottish Rugby Union and was my art teacher at Fuller Academy, and was just an amazingly lovely guy. He came from Shetland and he was passionate about boats. He was a very good artist, and I would say, you know, he was a wonderful presence. This is Ricky on the right, obviously, with George Mackay Brown. It's difficult to emphasize how different and experimental Ricky Demarco's thinking was, that he would bring the students to the teachers, and the teachers were in their locale. So the students could sense the genus loci, the spirit of place that the artist, the teacher's work was rooted in. So they enticed George Mackay Brown on board the Marquess. And you can see the joy. I mean, George Mackay Brown wasn't known for smiling a lot, but he clearly had a great time and interacted with the crew, the participants on the voyage. And you can see the Old Man of Hoy there in the background. Another Orcadian who deserves to be much better known. I know a little of her work, but not all of it by any means, but she was a GP on Orkney and participated in Edinburgh Arts. She was also a filmmaker, a writer, a poet, and in fact one of the very few women who participated as what we might call faculty members, teachers on Edinburgh Arts. And she's reading from one of her books on the right there, and on her right is Robert Gàidhealtachd Sutherland, who lived in Edinburgh and was a Scot. He wrote in the Scots language. and he was also a participant in Edinburgh Arts. And I'd like to emphasize Demarco's commitment to the arts of Scotland. He's often castigated for all manner of things, and maybe is associated with avant-gardism from Europe, but he was equally passionate and supportive of the traditional Scottish culture and writing, art, music, theatre, etc. in general, and conducted many, many activities over many decades with Scottish participants. Many of you will have known, or at least have heard of, John McInnes. And I'm proud to say I regarded him as a friend. Well, I was a young student. I used to sit in Bannerman's bar in Edinburgh and listen to him. He could, you know, talk the back legs off a horse, but he was fascinating to listen to. And once told me that he'd written his PhD in 6 weeks, which, you know, I took about 10 years to write mine. So, but anyway, this is him with Murdo McFarlane in Lewis, because Demarco's Edinburgh Arts obviously went to all through the Outer Hebrides and to Callanish and various locations in the Uists and Harris, etc. But I think some of the younger American students got hit with a real Cayley. And that's probably something that most of them would never forget. It's interesting to note that on Edinburgh Arts 75, McInnes was lecturing on 17th century Gaelic women poets. Another person that they visited and talked with was Marion Campbell. I didn't meet her, but she was a kind of one-person Harris Tweed industry and did all her own. She did the whole caboodle from beginning to end, the sheep and spinning and carding and dyeing the wool and then making the tweed at the end. So again, I would say this is a mark of egalitarianism, that Demarco did not draw a distinction between art and craft, nor did he draw a distinction between the traditional and the avant-garde, and he tried to bring these things together into a single experience. This is Neagu. I think he's trying to imitate one of the stones. It was before they were revealed in their actual true height. I'm not quite sure as an art critic what I make of someone standing with a blanket over their head next to I'm not sure if I would regard it as particularly deep and meaningful. But the reason it's there is because there's a contrast between Demarco's work as an excellent watercolorist, printmaker, and draftsperson, who paradoxically is quite content to create what you might call quite traditional work and yet place it against the avant-gardism of Neagu. So that's the end of the talk. If you have any questions, I would very much welcome any kind of questions. If you don't agree with anything I said, fine, that's good. I'd like to hear from you. Don't be shy.
That's wonderful, Giles. More and more, and thank you very much.
Okay. Who have we got? I can see various. I can see Hugh here.
Yeah. Giles, if you click to get out of the slideshow, you should be able to see everybody, or if not everybody, a better proportion of people. And h-Alba, if you would like to turn on your cameras so we can say hello to you properly, you're very welcome to. There's no compulsion, but it's always nice to see some friendly faces. And as we move into the question and answer session, I can't always see all of you on my screen. So if you'd like to ask a question or make a point, please do use the chat, or there's a option at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand, and then I'll know that you've got something to say and I'll be able to find you. Whereas you might be waving away like anything, but on the next page of the screen, and I won't know that you're there and hoping to speak. So do please let us know when you've got something to say. But first, can I just start by saying thank you, Giles, for such a fascinating talk, and the range of material that you covered and the kinds of sources that you've been trawling through to make a story that's so clear to us. It's really wonderful. And what what an amazing collection of people to bring together to get up to really interesting things. Is absolutely fascinating. Can I open now to the floor for questions or points, or any of you people online? I had two questions to start with, and actually a point about your shot from Kilmartin Glen. I sent it off to a pal of mine, Rachel Butter, who was involved in developing the Kilmartin Museum at the very beginning, and she said she doesn't know what he was up to there, but one of his best friends, Andy Elliott, lived in Crinan, so potentially it was something to do with visiting him. But he maintained that connection to Kilmartin and came to visit them when they were first starting up the idea of the museum, and was very involved and supportive at that stage. So that's...
Yeah, I've been to Kilmartin myself quite a few times, but I think some of the things that the students were up to, there's lots of photographs of them crawling into, chambered graves and moving stones around.
and all sorts of things that they wouldn't be allowed to do now. Yeah, I mean, I suppose that was one of my main questions. You touched on some of the logistical challenges that must have been involved, but how on earth did they actually pay for everything and get it all up and running? I mean, even in the days of more generous Arts Council funding, it's very hard to imagine how they could have financed an operation as ambitious as that.
Okay, well, I mean, I'm not, I'm the world's worst person with finance myself, but what I would say is that they were quite well funded from the Arts Council up until 1980, as I said. They got quite a generous grant which allowed Demarco to have a staff. He would come up with all the great ideas, and then an administrative staff would enact them. So there was a kind of symbiosis there. And also, as I said, a lot of the participants were drawn from, well, initially anyway, they were drawn from North American colleges. So those people that came from that route were paying. But also the whole thing was, in fact, it was supposed to be a commercial venture as well. And one of the quotes, which I didn't read out in one of the slides, was hinting, is this actually a form of tourism for, for arty people? Or what's the difference between tourism and what Demarco was up to? And it's a very good question, because they do overlap. And I've heard Demarco, what's the word? There's no other word, ranting about how he's not a tourist and he hates tourism, but yet there he is going around places doing something that he says isn't tourism, but from the point of view of a casual observer, they might regard it as a form of tourism. And it's a good question. It's a good question to think about and debate, because he thinks that what he's doing is special and different, but other people might not agree.
Yeah. Yeah, fascinating. I'm sure that will come up in the discussion as it proceeds.
Can I come in, Abby?
Of course.
Thank you very much, Giles. That was.
Oh, you're there. I thought you were in Inverness.
Luckily, on my way to Inverness, I called into my son's house to pick up a cake and found they were already there.
All right.
They'd already come back after.
Well, I'm so sorry I couldn't manage to be in person. Was kind of floored, and I'm a bit better now, but the journey was just beyond me, I'm afraid. So
you'll come again, and
yeah.
I hope the weather will be as nice as it was this time. Well, I hope by the time I come to the end of my ramble now, my question will be cogent. As an Edinburgh girl myself, I found this all fascinating, and I do remember that gallery in Gillespie Crescent, and I remember seeing Demarco on several occasions, and he was very charismatic. I didn't know about John Donne's Scottish Academy, but I have taught philosophy here, and I know about his John Duns Scotus's concept of haikaitas, the thisness of things.
Thisness of things, yeah.
The thisness of things. And I was thinking, when you were speaking, if Richard Demarco had ended up somewhere else, would he have done the same? And I think he probably would, because I expect that his refusal of borders between, as you said, craft and art, and traditional and avant-garde. And I would add to that, the archaeology, and I see Antonia's here too, and she sent you a special message. I used to think that archaeology was just about old things, and it became a revelation to me during Winter to the West that archaeology is often about art and then there's no difference really between art and sacred ritual. We don't know what the difference is, I think, from our secular perspective or from whatever perspective.
Yeah.
I thought I heard in what you were saying a criticism of Demarco for documenting much and analysing little. And maybe you'll answer me in a few minutes if that is a criticism, or if you think his genius was to chuck a whole lot of things up in the air, ask a lot of questions, sometimes be pretentious, sometimes be a bit of a charlatan, perhaps, but out of all the stirred up mud, there would come some gold glitter, because I think that's often what artists do. They make connections where nobody else sees connections.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Meg. I mean, it wasn't a criticism of Demarco, it was an observation about the fact that although he became and still is probably a real Kent name, when I talk to people generally about him, and he does come up quite often in conversation, the first thing they say was, oh, we all thought that he didn't have any film in his camera, which wasn't true, because I've looked at literally millions of photographs. I mean, there's just endless amounts, and a lot of them the film isn't even developed, I've come across boxes of film, of 35mm film that hasn't even been processed. It's not that he didn't analyze his own work. By default, he is, although the situation is changing, he is the main interpreter of his own actions. But subsequently, I've done, I think I was the first PhD, but there's one other PhD that's being published, and I've a bone to pick with Edinburgh University Press for not being interested in my PhD, which I think should see the light of day. And there are other academic studies that are underway, but the various people have made films, and I just lament at the at the complete lack of analysis. They follow his narrative, they document and report, but they don't analyze. And I think that type of discourse is sorely missing in this context. And it deserves to be analysed. It begs to be analysed because it has such richness to offer. And of course, we can't understand things unless we analyse them. And we have to be able to ask questions and say, well, is that valid? Did that work? How did it work? If so, etc. And you all know what I'm talking about because that's what you're engaged in Sabhal Mòr Ostaig. So I think there's a great deal of richness that has yet to be uncovered, and that is still highly relevant to contemporary understanding and interests, maybe even more so than at the time. I mean, I think the oil conference that I mentioned, I mean, they had Bucky Fuller there. I mean, the guy's a genius, and he wrote, you know, absolutely presciently about the kind of crisis that we're in right now. You know, and there's all sorts of avenues that could be explored. And so I admire Demarco greatly for his ability to really push the boundaries, and people laughed at him and were very, you know, skeptical and unkind in many cases. But yet, you know, I can admire him for that greatly. So this is a very chunky book that I haven't really read much of, but don't know if you can read it, but it's one of Bucky Fuller's books, and it talks about energy and nuclear weapons and ecological crisis, and it was written in, I think it was 1980 or something like that, maybe a bit before. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, 81 it was published. So I think there's a lot of material and a lot of ideas that have still to be explored in the archive. You know, although I spent nearly nine years on it, I still felt I was skimming the surface. And I don't think his work is, I mean, it's because he has, as you said, kind of clownish aspects. You know, he's the holy fool, if you like. He's the one that's allowed to ask the king difficult questions. He's been regarded in that way unfairly because actually the guy's deadly serious and has done and said, yeah, you're right. A lot of things that just sound completely like nonsense, but mixed in with all of that, there's some deeply important and precious thinking.
Giles, can I maybe move things on a bit by, I suppose the link in my mind is the turn in the ways that people are beginning to shift from understanding of, say, the 18th century travellers to Scotland and what they made of Scotland, and if you like, the visitees, what the people who were visited upon made of that experience. And we're very lucky to have in the room with us somebody who was a visitee to an extent, who remembers the bark arriving in Armadale. Is that right?
Well, actually, I go back further than that, because when I was about 17, I went to school very near Scotia's Academy, and I first encountered Demarco on the top of an Edinburgh Corporation bus when he'd continue his art lectures to his students in the top of the bus. And of course, I had no idea who he was, but he was so enthusiastic, you know, who is this? And then later as a student, I mean, what you've given me today is actually a complete trip down memory lane from my youth, because almost all the things you've gone through are things I was aware of or attended, or all sorts of things like that. And a lot of my friends were very sort of worked with Demarco, but I was here in 75 as a student when Demarco came with his...
Oh, fantastic. I wish I'd known that, because I would have liked to have spoken to you a bit more, because I didn't have access to, to people. The only person that I managed to speak to, and she was in one of the photographs, was an artist called Rose Frayne. She was in the photograph with Adam Robson. And how can I put it diplomatically? It wasn't an easy interview, put it that way. So I would have loved to have met and discussed more about the views and feelings of the participants. And I did reach out to many of them, but a lot of people aren't with us anymore and so on. So it was quite hard to get first-hand original source material.
I'll take you round when you come up to visit Veronica.
He certainly breezed in. Sorley was busy lecturing us, and he arrived in a sort of like a cloud coming into the classroom. Here, no, over there in the old building.
So Sorley was actually involved in teaching in the college at that time as well.
He may just have been visiting. His wife was actually in my class.
Right.
I was on a short course at the college.
Okay.
But I have a very good friend who was very involved with Demarco called David Gothard, who at one time was director of the Traverse. And I don't know if you came across him at all in your researches. He's in London now, but he was very involved with a lot of things that Demarco did, and with Beuys and all these people, and the sort of festival in the art college.
Well, I've got a love-hate relationship with Demarco, but he hasn't read my PhD, and I've only heard about it secondhand from other people. But apparently, the only thing that he's said is it's not complete. But how on earth do you complete something like that? It's impossible. I mean, the person you just mentioned at the Traverse, I haven't heard of them. So the idea that a PhD is an all-encompassing, it's an encyclopedia isn't right. It's a snapshot. You have to be very selective, and there's clearly room for other scholarship. And as I said, there's clearly space for a lot more work. And I also feel that, slightly digressing, but the nature of archives are very important. And we're now moving into a kind of post-archive world where it's going to be difficult for people to retrieve information in the same kind of way. So, but I found that it was a very precious, very valuable thing that he did with the summer schools. But it shouldn't really be seen in isolation from his other activities, because when the summer schools were happening, he was doing all sorts of other things. I mean, that Polish exhibition, I mean, it was massive, and it was happening at the same time as the summer school. It wasn't officially part of the summer school, but there he was doing that as well. So,
Carsten, Elena, anybody who's in the Zoom room, would you like to come in with thoughts? William?
Thanks so much. That was a fascinating talk, and I really, really enjoyed it. You're taking us back to an age of, before the wall fell, and the time of the special unit. It's like going back to another era. I should put in, just since we're talking about Black Mountain College, I'll just put into the chat something which I found out this morning when I was reading a review saying that at the same time as Cage was premiering 4 minutes and 33 seconds. The first happening, which he did, Theatre Piece #1. He was also involved in writing music for the musical Brigadoon the same week. So you could have gone to the first ever happening theatre piece #1, and you could have gone to Brigadoon the following evening.
Yeah, well, I mean that makes my point. I mean, Demarco, he wasn't shy of bridging, you know, different aspects of culture, you know, and you know, I can say a lot about him, but the man is not a snob. He will democratically engage with people, you know, from all walks of life, and you know, I've seen it happening many times.
Yeah. What I was going to ask was, you know, we have evidence from the summer schools in terms of, you know, recordings of happenings, of events, of undeveloped film and the like. But, you know, what did the students, you know, is there any way of being able to find how this affected the students who took part in the happenings? Are there any, you know, artworks which came out of the school, which we were able to find? Because I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah, exactly. I did come across a journal of one student, a young American woman from one of the earlier summer schools, who had made a beautiful notebook, and had written down, amongst the information that she was being given, had written down some of her thoughts and feelings. What I can say is, I mean, when you're 20 and some very energetic, charismatic person comes from Scotland and spins tales of castles and fairies, and it's very seductive, and I mean that in all senses of the word. And I think many people fell under his spell because he is, or was, you know, a very engaging person. You know, and I don't, you know, it was romantic, again, in all senses of the word, that it was a form of seduction in a way, you know, seduction with words. However, I mean, I think one way of gauging response is to look at the exhibitions that happened both en route, as it were, and afterwards, because most of the summer schools were followed up by exhibitions, but again, there were participatory art events, people making art as part of the project. And what I would say is there was great enthusiastic engagement, because he managed to, I mean, he had people, you know, Joseph Beuys teaching, Paul Neagu teaching, Bucky Fuller teaching. That's a remarkable assemblage of people by any measure.
Yeah.
I should say, just we do have a Bucky Dome in Somhairle Mòr Ostaig as well.
I know.
We did have two, but one blew away. So
that's why, yeah. Well, all these across the Highlands, there are all these greenhouses that were, you know, basically Bucky domes, you know, because they apparently, most of the time anyway, can sustain a lot more weather than conventional geometries.
And one last thing I was going to ask was there any dance involved?
Yes,
When you look at the Black Mountain, dance was such an important
Well,
part
there was Stuart Hobbs, and he had actually worked with Merce Cunningham. So there were various direct links with Black Mountain, and dance was a very, very important part of it. And again, you know, the students were exposed to traditional Scottish dance forms as well as the music. So that, yes, it was an extremely important element. And if you go to there's an online archive which has about 10,000 images, which, you know, is a lot, but compared to the total isn't a lot. But there are plenty of images of Stuart Hobbs with the students doing, and some very embarrassing photographs of Sandy Nairn trying to take part, you know, as he reminded me when I went to interview him. So yeah, definitely. So I've just had a message here from Murdo MacDonald. I don't know if it's the my friend Murdo, I think it is, but I don't know if he's there.
Yeah.
He's still
He's waving. He's waving.
Can't see him. I can't because I can only see a handful of people.
Oh, his sound doesn't work.
I think he's looking. But hi, Murdo. Yeah, he's sent a link.
Yeah, so this is coming back to this issue of
tourism. Yeah,
is he being
and
a
Patrick
tourist or not?
Geddes. Yeah, because I mean, what I should mention is, and I asked Demarco about this specifically because Demarco worked at the Outlook Tower as a young person, and I said, well, did Patrick Geddes's thinking have any effect on you, any impact? He said no, and I said, but how can that be? He worked in the Outlook. No, he was not. No, I won't know. But I don't believe him. You know, I'm sure that he was. You know, this is the thing about Demarco. He's almost impossible to interview. You know, you ask him a question and he just starts talking about whatever he wants to talk about. And so when I tried asking him about Patrick Geddes, he just said, oh, no, and he started talking about something else. And I just thought, I wish I could get the truth out of him, but that's
You're not going to get
that you have to deal with when you're dealing with Demarco.
Can I ask, I'm just coming back to that question around tourism and whether that idea of pilgrimage makes more sense of what he thought he was trying to do, or Giles, I hope I'm not misreading you, that there's a sort of sense that you're maybe catching a feeling that part of what was going on is potentially a bit exploitative of the places that he's going to. And I know that's very much a contemporary sensibility of concern around tourism and the impacts of tourism, but perhaps something that might have had its seeds in earlier passages. Have you found much about I suppose the cultural brokers who helped him make the connections with the people that he visited, and who got him into Shawbost, who got him into visits with weavers and with some of the people you've shown us that he was meeting clearly might have had their own connections to literary and artistic circles, but others might not have done. Anything to say about how that worked for them?
If I understand your question correctly, it's about gaining access to people that might be in some senses hidden or unavailable. And the answer is I don't know. I mean, it was a very different world in the 70s. Everything was done either by phone or letter. And all I can say is that Demarco was never shy about making contact with people. If he wanted to get hold of someone, he would. And he had what we would now call a network, but in those days wasn't. So, and he cleverly understood that to make things happen, you had to build bridges with people who were influential. And that allowed things to happen. So there are countless people that, were landowners or merchant bankers or, whatever. And he would have used those networks to facilitate, for good purposes, what he wanted to do. But again, as I said, things were much less official in those days on health and safety. And you could just turn up in places and do what you wanted. It wasn't like it is now. You mean there's visitor centre at Skye Brae, and there's restrictions on a lot of ancient monuments in the way that there wasn't. So, it's difficult to imagine that world somehow 50 odd years ago. But I would say that the point of tourism, I mean, I hate to think of his carbon footprint. I mean, he must have flown, to Mars and back, It's like, I don't know how many miles he doesn't seem to think about that kind of thing at all. Did ask him, and just not a factor whatsoever.
Hugh's been hovering on the verge of a question for a little while. I hope I'm not misreading your mic going on and off, Houston.
No, just thank you so much. That's a fantastic account.
Thank you.
I felt that Ricky Demarco was part of my presence in my life for so long, and without really getting to know him, I was stuck, as it were, in the conventional world of museums and galleries, where you weren't allowed to be too free-spirited, and so that Ricky was this wildly eclectic character who was out, of course, on purpose, outside the restrictions of the museums and galleries. But at the end of the day, I was heard a lot about the Ricky Demarco archive and how it was coming to the galleries, and how there was a lot of excitement about this. And then when it came, equally a lot of dismay, because it was so huge, and having been delivered, as it were, it then deliveries continued for days and weeks and months of pieces of paper, which of course Ricky recognized as potentially significant and so forth. And I'm just wondering, on the one hand, a largely unordered archive is a matter of huge excitement for the researcher, but equally, you know, what is going to be made of it in the long term, do you think? I mean, I think it should be used more and more.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. Slightly serious answer, because there is information in the public domain, so I'm not sharing anything that isn't public, that the archive, basically the archive is divided into 3 parts. One of them is in the National Galleries of Scotland, so that was bought in '95, so it was putatively material up to that point. There is a substantial amount in Terry and Newman's property near Pennycook, and thirdly, the material at Somhairle. Now, there were 12 or 13 rooms full of artwork, books, catalogues, letters, correspondence, film, objects, and Somhairle is being closed, or at least it's changing ownership. And apparently, one of the ideas, and it's a bit more than an idea, is that this should be donated to Poland, to the Museum Sztuki that I mentioned earlier, because Demarco has quite a long history with Poland and this museum in Łódź. And I think personally that would be a great tragedy for Scotland, for many reasons, for scholars and biographers and researchers certainly, but also because it's a major cultural asset that pertains greatly to Scotland and was funded not only by private individuals but also through the taxpayer. So the idea that, you know, you're giving a Titian away to another country, it's an equivalent, or in fact even